Hello, and welcome to our WriteHive annual conference panel, Cultural Family Dynamics and How They Impact the Story. My name is Stefanie, and I'll be this panel's moderator. I'm so excited for you to hear from our panelists today, and I'd like to start by giving each of them a quick introduction. First is Monique Collins, a Gullah Geechee middle child from South Carolina. She grew up fighting monsters with Xena the Warrior Princess and writing speculative stories on old, dusty computers her father found around their city like buried treasure. She loves books with strong female leads, fantastical cultures, and complicated romances. Her favorite places to write include boat docks and hippie camping trips. She graduated with an English degree from Wofford College and an MFA in popular fiction writing and publishing from Emerson College. She is the founder of Afronauts Podcast. As a high school English teacher and writer, she believes that books can empower generations. Monique, can you please share more with us about you?
Thank you, Stefanie. I'm just really happy to be here today, and also really happy to represent my Gullah Geechee culture. It's very near and dear to my heart, and great to be with everyone.
Thank you. Our next panelist is C.H. Hung, who grew up among the musty book stacks of public libraries, where she found a lifelong love for good stories and lost 20/20 vision for good. Her stubbornly rational soul intersects with an irrational belief in magic, which means her stories are often as mixed up as she is, melding the plausible with myth and folklore. Her stories have appeared in Analog, Science Fiction and Fact, Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine, The Martian, Dreamforge, and Choreo magazines, as well as anthologies edited by Kevin J. Anderson and Christine Catherine Rush, among others. Cindy, please tell us more about you.
Hi, everyone. I'm super happy to be here as well. I'm really excited to come back for a second year here at WriteHive. So thank you very much for having me. As you can tell, I'm a little bit all over the place when it comes to genre and writing and editing and just all sorts of stuff. I have a butterfly brain and I just kind of land on whatever is interesting to me at the moment. So yeah, so again, happy to be here and really excited to work with you guys again.
Thank you, welcome. Next, we have with us Keir Alekseii. Keir is an associate literary agent at Azantian Literary Agency and hopes to one day represent best-selling writers from marginalized backgrounds, especially BIPOC authors born and raised in the global South. As a neurodivergent queer woman of color, she is invested in work with similar representation and passionate about creating space for voices not often recognized. Keir is also a freelance editor for hire and enjoys her day job as an educator and cat wrangler. She is a past participant of the Cropper Residential Writing Workshop and a poet author fellow of the Martha's Vineyard Institute of Creative Writing. Keir, can you please tell us more about you?
Sure. I feel like that is fairly comprehensive for all like the important things today. But I do want to say that the cats that I often wrangle may make guest appearances today. So please, forgive me if they like throw the camera over or something, that might happen. And also I'm a little nasal today, so I beg your forgiveness in advance if I sneeze during an answer. Other than that, I am open to queries. My manuscript wish list should be online. And I am really excited. I'm really excited for this panel.
Thank you. Finally, we have Danai Christopoulou. Danai writes myth punk, science fiction, fantasy, and romance inspired by her heritage, which is Greek, Egyptian, and Romanian, as well as her experiences living abroad as a queer femme person and writer. Forever unable to pick one field of study, Danai takes courses in archaeology, history of religions, media, and cognitive linguistics at Linnaeus University in Sweden. In her free time, she geeks out about superheroes and time travel, spoils her cats and chickens, and does tarot readings for writers. Danai is represented by Lauren Beaker of Fine Print Literary, and her debut novel is currently out on submission. Danai, please share with us a little bit more about you.
Hi, everyone. I am so happy to be here. This is my first year as a panelist at WriteHive. And it's so nice to be here like at the other side of the table because it was so enriching as an experience last year to just participate. So I'm just super happy for this and that's all.
Thank you. Perfect. Thank you everyone for sharing. And for those of you watching, please feel free to ask our panelists your questions. We will have them with us in the chat to help answer. So let's get into our questions, starting with, what are some examples of how cultural family dynamics can impact a story? Cindy, can we start with you?
Yeah, so I think family is really important to sometimes, a lot of times, the central theme of a story, right? I know that for me personally, a lot of times I'm writing because there's some sort of particular family dynamic that I'm writing about, and it's what's speaking to me from the heart at that moment. One of the key questions that I tend to ask when people are talking about, well, how important is the family to the story, is I ask them, if you put this story in a different type of family, would this story still work? And if it doesn't, then that family and the way that family works is part and parcel of that story and is the reason why that story exists. You know, I think about one of the first movies or stories that really blew me away, because not only was it about family, but it was about how twisted family could be in this sort of like slow burn horror feel. And I'm sure a lot of us have seen this movie already, was Parasite. You know, it's about this Korean family, this Southern Korean family struggling to make ends meet, but the way they go about it is just so twisted and deliberate, and just like, if you think about, can you have done this story in, for example, America? I don't know that you could have. Like, I don't know which region of America you could have set that story in and still have it work as beautifully as it did. And so, yes, I do think that when you think about the family and how you've set up your story, it needs to be key to how you tell that story.
So the characters in most of my stories are tethered to some sort of familial connection. I think that the culture of the family and just the culture of the characters, period, is what really drives a lot of the plot questions in my stories. When I think of a character, I like to kind of track their motivations based on family expectations, and this could be rooted in my own my own experiences. I come from a very large family. I have 5 siblings and several cousins. So family has always been important in my own personal social structures. So character dynamics and how characters respond to a situation always goes back to their familial roots and their culture. And I really like to kind of torture my characters a little bit and kind of figure out, okay, what cultural expectations are they willing to relinquish in order to get what they want? And what will they refuse to give up? And what does that mean for them then on their journey as they grow through the story?
Yes. To what what Sage and Monique said. I feel like our families and the cultures our families are steeped in help to instill the values, the belief systems, the things that we hold near and dear. And when Monique said that bit about what cultural expectations are they willing to break to achieve their goals, that really, really hit with me. The cultural family dynamics that I experienced growing up is very different to what I saw and experienced when I lived in the US for a brief period of time. Family is sort of, it should be the biggest priority, you know, where I'm from. And when I was away, they prized individuality and like individualism a lot more. And so I think that alone can dictate so many different things about your character, what they do, why they do it, what the stakes are for your character as they move through the plot, and how they change as a person as well, right? So I think that's just a small aspect of how those family dynamics and those relationships can change. And I think it's also important to add that it's not just about the family dynamics in what we might consider the traditional family with like your parents and siblings, but in blended families and found families as well, because that also sets up somewhat different expectations depending on the rest of that family history or the rest of those cultural expectations. Because I think in some cultures, things are more acceptable, some approaches are more acceptable than others, and that also has a heavy influence.
So there's a lot of about what Keir said about found families that I also wanted to focus on. It's interesting for me to see, like from my own experience, because I come from a Mediterranean culture where, you have this very traditional nuclear family where the matriarchal figures are super, how you see in the movies and all those stereotypes. But my personal experience in my own home was very different from like what is the norm in my country. And then when I moved to Sweden, I realized how different family norms are here and how much more independent people are, and how blended families and found families are also more common here. So I'm always gravitating towards the found family structures, but I also like to pay attention to all the different ways family can be expressed in a story, whether I write it or I consume it as a reader.
Wonderful. So our next question is, how important is it to have the character's culture be an integral part of the main plot? We've talked a little bit about this in some of our answers, but maybe we can dive a little bit deeper on it. Keir, can we start with you?
Sure. Honestly, I think that this answer really varies widely based on your genre and your intentions, right? Some of us, we write to explore the cultures, the family dynamics, all of those nuances and differences. And some of us write whole new secondary worlds where maybe we have borrowed from our own culture, but the expectations and the setup of all of those things are very different. And so I do think that whether or not your character's culture is an integral part of the main plot depends very heavily on what you're writing about, the setting that you're writing in, your genre expectations, right? That's kind of what I'm getting at when I talk about setting, and what your goals are for this character and how they change. So when Monique mentioned earlier that she's looking at what cultural expectations her characters are pushing against and breaking, then yes, then perhaps the character's culture is an integral part of the plot there, right? But that doesn't always have to be the case. So I think that is a very, so maybe this is not a helpful answer because it depends. It's basically where I'm going with this.
Well, you mentioned Monique. Why don't we jump to Monique?
Okay, sure. For me personally, and whether this is like culture that's simmering somewhere deep in the background or in the foreground, for me, culture is always integral to the plots of my stories. But it varies, right? Because this could be an actual living, breathing culture. It can be my own culture, or it can be a culture that I've created. So I guess it just depends on how deep I wade into that cultural tide. For example, if I'm writing about robots, then I'm making a culture for them, and I find that very important. But I also think I view it a little differently than a culture that is existing and alive in the world today. But I value culture in stories because I value characters in stories. I'm a very character-driven writer as well as a character-driven reader. And so for me, their backgrounds, their stories always need to be experienced in the plot. So that's kind of how I view it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Danai, same for you. What do you think?
I hate to repeat, but I think also depends would be my answer. And also, like, every story has a different character that is kind of like reveals itself to you sometimes while you write. But to be fair, no one exists, no character whether they live in a secondary world or in our world, no character ever exists in a vacuum, right? And even with made-up cultures, it's very interesting to see like what makes them tick, and their background and their traumas and their hopes are, of course, like very much connected to this. So.
So I don't think you can take culture out of the story, even if you are using an existing, whether you're using an existing culture or if you're making one up, wholly from scratch, because culture is, I mean, if you think about the way culture is defined or should be defined in a story, it's about the environment and the social environment that character exists in, right? So whether, well, to a certain extent, I agree that different genres are going to have different expectations. If you're writing about werewolves, there's a werewolf culture that you have to create, whether you're basing it off real wolves or you're being inspired by it to create something totally different. And you have to think about, okay, how does the culture work within that community, right? Your werewolves, and how does it work outside that community? How people view werewolves. And I know it's kind of a silly example, but that's what I mean when I say you do have to be mindful about the culture of your characters and also the other the cultures that come up against that character's culture. N.K. Jemisin has a really great masterclass about world building in which she touches upon this idea of, two people are passing each other on the sidewalk, coming head to head, who gives way and why? You think about that question, and that's where culture, that's like a small piece of coming up with the idea of what that culture looks like and why that culture works the way it does, and where those conflicts are, where plot can arise. So yeah, in short, I think you can't help but think about culture every time you create a story.
Great.
Is it okay if I have a bit of an ADD moment right now and a little so what CH said just now, I think that's a really, really good point, actually. So I'm looking, in my own answer when I was responding, I was thinking strictly about decisions that are integral to the culture, like making decisions, the character making decisions and choosing, because I was thinking about that being an integral part of the main plot, right? But I think that that's actually a really, really good point that you brought up, because characters' decisions and how those decisions drive the plot are always dependent on their culture, right? Because, well, to add to that, we connect with characters based on that too. So I think that my answer is still kind of it depends, because I feel like I have absolutely read stories where they really worked for me, and while their culture obviously informed the character and their decisions, I didn't feel like that cultural aspect was necessarily part of the goal from getting from point A to point B and the plot itself. But that is definitely food for thought for me, because you're right, you can't really divorce a story from the cultures that inform it in any genre. So thank you for that.
Yes, thank you all. So let's talk a little bit more about how do you feel the family dynamics impact the stories that you are telling? Monique, why don't we start with you?
Sure. For me, family dynamics always plays some sort of role in my stories. And I didn't really realize this until now. But again, I think it goes back to my own personal history with family and how big of a family I have. But when I think of a character, I always start by thinking about the people that have the most dynamic impact in their lives. And that's usually parents, whether they didn't have their parents or whether they had great parents or just their roots. Even, thinking about it as a teacher, when children develop or when a youth develops their first years of life, that impacts who they become. So I always kind of start there, thinking about the impact of family on a character and what drives that character to do what they do. So for me, family dynamics are very important. When I tell my stories, I just realized that recently I don't have a lot of, I don't think I have a lot of fathers in my stories, which is really like weird because my father plays a big role in my life. So I kind of had to examine that and change that a bit. But I have a lot of mothers, relationships with mothers in my stories, whether the mothers are werewolves or they're humans. Just the dynamics between mothers and sisters kind of speaks to me a little more than other relationships do.
Well, I seem to be completely unable to give my characters happy families. So these poor people always end up in trauma. Like one of my characters is literally haunted by her dead mother. Another is just like trying to find a different like mother figures in other people because her own mother has not been that for her. And of course, there's part of that that also kind of like are connected to my own experience. But apart from that, it's also because I'm interested in seeing how, you know, people who may come from a household that doesn't exactly understand them or accept them for everything that they are, can go on later in life and find those missing puzzle pieces in other people. So we return to the found families thing here for me.
Well, gosh. So I am a Taiwanese American immigrant, and I think that immigrant experience dictates a lot of what I do when it comes to bringing family into the equation. Because we grew up with just, you know, the nuclear family. We did not have an extended family. We didn't have that experience of having a big family. And I only have one sibling, so we don't have a big family as it is. And so I think a lot of my stories personally deal with the intimate relationships between specific family members as we're trying to figure out, you know, how that works as we grow and age, when we grow apart or we grow closer, that sort of thing. I'm also a person who, you know, I don't have kids, and I'm of an age where people have stopped asking why I don't have kids. And that's a really interesting dynamic to be a part of as well, you know, when you're a woman and you choose not to have children. And that raises all sorts of interesting questions of what does that mean for the continuity of family, especially, you know, as an immigrant family who set down roots in a different country. Is there going to be future generations? Well, we don't know yet. But so yeah, for me personally, the question of family comes up often because I do think about it a lot of, especially as I get older, of what's that going to be, what that means for me to have, you know, to be searching for a past, to be, you know, reconnecting with my roots and my heritage, but also to look toward the future of what am I going to leave behind when I have such a small family to begin with. That's also, by the way, one of the reasons why one of my favorite publications out there is Choreo, which you can see the cover right here on my screen, because it is a magazine written by and written for people of diasporic communities, you know, people who are immigrants and of various diasporas. So sorry, quick plug, check them out if you have a time, because it's awesome. There's so many stories about that, about family and identity in that publication.
I wanna support that quick plug because I had also subscribed to Choreo and I have since its first year. Very good.
Thank you for that recommendation. Definitely check that out. Keir, why don't we stay with you? What about for your writing?
Well, this question is a little bit harder for me to answer because I do a lot less writing now and a lot more editing and focusing on my agent work. But gosh, how do family dynamics impact the stories that I tell? I think that I lean a lot on emotional responses and emotional perspectives and how family informs that. A lot of my stories don't necessarily focus on family relationships, but sort of outside that. And what that means is the family is foundational to character decisions and their support network for all the things that happen outside. And I say that not because the family, you know, again, the difference between like the traditional, like everybody is genetically related family versus found family and so on, but it is the same for that too. Whether it's discovery of that found family or otherwise, I do find that is what I write. And something that I think is important that we may not have touched on just yet is power dynamics. Families, their power dynamics, what those power dynamics will look like varies across cultures. And I think the power dynamics generally play a fairly prominent role in my work as a writer. And I think that how that plays out within the family is a big part of my writing. But to swing into the sort of other eye for a little bit, I also find that idea of power dynamics that echoes throughout a story, right? From the family level, from the societal to the societal level, and so on and so on. And that is something that I do look at because it's such an important part of your world building, as well as your character development and how strong a character you have, whether that is a protagonist, an antagonist, a secondary character, and so on.
So how do you represent cultural family dynamics without being cliche or harmful? Can I start with you, Danai?
So because I tend to be an outlier myself when it comes to my own culture and how I relate to family, I think I gravitate towards looking for those people who are a bit of outliers in my stories. So I will very often write about people who are not the most representative of their own culture, if that makes sense, or who struggle with elements of their family dynamics or within their culture and what that means for them and how they grow from that, or what things they need to come to terms with in order to move forward. So I don't know if I answered your question.
For me, this question is always kind of circling in my head, how not to be cliche or how not to be harmful, especially as it relates to my own culture, the Gullah Geechee culture. And mostly, I mean, it's twofold. One, as an African-American, there's already a lot of stereotypes and just lack of representation out there, in print, in publication. And then as a Gullah Geechee African-American, most people don't even know what that culture is, like, you know? And so, and you don't find that culture represented in a lot of books. I know it was represented in Root Magic, which is a middle grade book, very great book, but it's not out there a lot. So I always try to be mindful of what I write about when it comes to my own culture, but I also kind of don't want to toe the line between like respectability politics and things of that nature, because it's very easy to allow like kind of like the white noise to dominate your decisions, especially when you're in a group that's traditionally marginalized as a writer. So just kind of making sure that I don't take heed to, or that I ignore a lot of the white normative traditions that are infamous in publishing, making sure that I'm not normalizing the dominant culture in my writing. That's kind of how I avoid those cliches and represent not only my culture, but the cultures that I write about to the best of my ability.
Yeah, so I think a lot of where cliches and unintentional harming or comes from is when people forget to treat people like real people, which seems so simple, but at the same time, you know, I know, like, you know, cliches are a shortcut. You're trying to flesh out a character really fast and just a few words, and it's, it's fine to start there, but you still want to go back and flesh out that character with specific details and things that are unique to that character, so that they don't stay a cliche, or they don't stay that cardboard cutout. So I think that's what some people forget to do, is they forget to go back and flesh that out. So especially for me, like I'm a discovery writer, so definitely, I'm writing fast as I go anyway. So I always have to go back and make sure that I'm fleshing things out. One of the things that really helps, speaking of specificity, is having those details. One of the things I really appreciated about the movie Turning Red is how specific that story was to Toronto and the Chinese community, and just in everything, the way it was set and setting, the tone, I mean, the visual details and the speech, like it was a very Chinese Canadian movie, and I loved it, even though, I'm not Canadian and I'm not, of that specific Chinese community. It was still great. I still loved how real the characters felt because of those details, what that brought to the experience. So yeah, I think, just getting real with the characters and making sure that you're being specific about their experiences and their environment and the things that are driving them, and, the challenges that they're facing. I think that would help a long way toward making sure that you're not putting a cliche on the page.
I have so many thoughts on this. I just need a second. I've got a lot to say. I agree quite a lot with what has been said by the other panelists too. It's one, I think that we need to distinguish between cliches and tropes. I think that those are different, and though that difference matters. Secondly, I think, Monique, you mentioned normalizing, not normalizing whatever the dominant culture is, but whatever if you're working with a marginalized culture or a culture that is underrepresented, not normalizing the overrepresented culture. I read a manuscript some time ago where the lead was a person of color, but every attractive person was white or white coded. And that was a huge red flag for me when I read that book. And I did point it out to the person I was supposed to point it out to. But those things are how you how you cause harm, in my opinion, right? By not keeping an eye on that. And I think it's okay if you have, some white coded characters who are attractive, but they should not be the only attractive people in your story, right? And I want to say that example echoes for cultural dynamics, cultural family dynamics, is that the family dynamic that you're representing from an underrepresented group should not be seen as simply not okay because it's not whatever the dominant culture also holds or believes in. And then going back and fleshing that work out, just like CH said. And I think Danai is who mentioned that so many of your characters were outliers, right? And what I like about that too is that when you have a character that is an outlier to that culture, it is a very easy way to put a lens on the ways in which certain traditions within that culture can be harmful without necessarily being harmful to the culture, yeah, but showing how it can influence an individual and create pain in an individual in a very real way. And I think that very real way is sort of the foundation of what I'm trying to get at here, is that authenticity, right? If you whitewash everything, for lack of a better term right now, I mean, because whitewashing is not the only way to do this. But when you do that with a culture that is rich in everything except whatever the white heteronormative like culture is. That's how you create harm. That's how you reduce what is a genuine cultural trope that we all love and enjoy and can relate to and can resonate. That's how you reduce it to a harmful cliche. Yeah. I feel like I have so much more to say, but my sinuses are clouding the whole rest of my brain. So I'm gonna stop there because I will just keep rambling. But I hope that my points kind of came across.
Absolutely. Thank you. Okay, so our next question is, do you represent in your writing any cultures that you're not familiar with? And if so, how did you go about representing them? Can I start with you, Cindy?
Sure. So I try not to, at least for my main protagonist, because I am so conscious of the fact that I don't want to be causing harm to other communities. And so a lot of times I'll rely on the old trope of write what you know. And a lot of what I know is about, you know, crossing different worlds and being part of two different worlds and just having that, you know, mixed up identity of being an immigrant who, you know, grew up in one culture but comes from another culture, and how does that work, or does it even work at all? And so I think by natural inclination, a lot of my characters wind up being very conflicted in that sense. And it's not necessarily, you know, they're not all immigrants, right? You know, although I did write an immigrant story set on Mars, but that's besides the point. It's more of the fact that, you know, I want to draw upon that experience rather than the identity of, oh, this is Taiwanese, or, oh, this is American, you know, that sort of thing. Because I also grew up loving and because this is what we were taught, right? I grew up loving the European myths. I loved the Brothers Grimm, the original Brothers Grimm, not the Disney versions. I loved Greek mythology. I mean, I swear Greek mythology is what got me into studying literature in English. I mean, like, this is what I loved growing up. So a lot of that is also an influence in my writing of this is what I love. And so, yeah, I'm gonna have Greek myth in my writing. Because this is what I know, even if I'm not a part of that culture, but it's what I love. So, but when I do want to bring in other influences, the way that I do it, and I'm not saying this is right or wrong, this is just the way I've done it is, you know, I might bring them in as a secondary character who's, you know, influencing what is going on with the plot or what's going on with the main protagonist. They might be the stakes character for me, for example, or not for me, but for that protagonist. And so far, I have not really made villains of people that aren't of a predominant culture. so far I haven't done that just because I don't feel comfortable yet doing that. But you know, yeah, I'm just very, very careful of what I put on the page of, can I defend this? Can I say, yes, this is a real person. This is, you know, what I'm basing this character off of, rather than, well, I'm just gonna throw this cliche on the page because it's easy, you know, so I never want to do that.
Yeah, I similarly also try to stay in my lane. I don't try to write cultures that I'm not familiar with very often at all. I think even within my own culture, when I am writing about it, I still reach out to other people who share my culture and say, hey, could you read this? Do you think this is accurate? Does this sound real? Does this resonate with you? Right? Because no culture is a monolith, and my experience with my family, with the culture that my family is from, the various cultures that my family is from, it's not a singular experience. And so even though I can say I'm writing from my lived experiences and what I have on this page is real, I am also keenly aware that the character I've written isn't me. So I need to go outside of my singular experience and be like, hey, everybody else who also experiences this culture, after reading this, what you know about the character, are these other things making sense to you? Because it's, you know, there's no singular way to represent these things. And sometimes It doesn't resonate with everybody else. And I think a really good parallel to this is sort of, my brain is not doing the words thing as good as normal, but so I was diagnosed with ADHD last year, and so now I feel a lot more comfortable writing characters who are like me and being like, that's an ADHD character, because I know it is, because I know what that's based on. But I would not write an autistic character just because I am neurodivergent. And autistic people also, many of them also, because not all of them probably, but many of them also identify as neurodivergent, right? I also don't identify as disabled, even though many folks consider ADHD to be a disability, especially with some of the accommodations that were recommended to me when I was diagnosed. But I still have not, I don't feel like that identity is right for me. And I don't necessarily mean that like in a bad way. I'm still grappling, with all the things that it means to have the brain that I have. And maybe I will decide that, no, this fits me too. But I'm not there yet. And I think if I did want to write about somebody who was a different kind of neurodivergent, I would have to do a lot of research, which would include real life interactions and interviews with people who have an autistic experience or whatever other neurodivergent experience. And I would have to have sensitivity readers who would have to read this and engage with it and so on. So I am exactly the same way when it comes to writing my own culture, much less outside of it. And I think that if you want to engage in non-harmful and authentic representation that people from whatever culture it is can look at and see themselves, because representation matters, right? Like those are watchwords for the future. And if you are going to write that and engage with it so that other people can see it and feel like, yes, I'm seen, right? That research, that special attention really has to be paid. Sorry, I rambled again. I'm so sorry.
No, thank you for sharing. We appreciate it, Keir. Danai, how about for you?
So for me, this is a loaded question because so many parts of my own culture are lost to me. Like, for instance, I haven't been able to meet my grandparents who come from Romania, or my grandparents who come from Egypt. I've never been to Egypt. So there's this whole part of my culture that I want to write in order to explore, but at the same time, I feel like a fraud when I'm trying to do so. And I think that that's a very common feeling with people who are immigrants or are part of the diaspora, or, of mixed heritage. And I think that we need to be able to push through and be aware that there won't be a perfect representation of any experience, because like other panelists said, that thing does not exist. This perfection does not exist. And also in terms of my Greek identity, if you look at publishing right now, there's so many books about Greek myths, and if you look at how many of these people who write these books are actually Greek authors, the percentage is probably, I want to say 1%, So this also kind of gives me a weird feeling like, can I even talk about my culture when my own culture has been whitewashed in a sense, by people from the UK and the US mostly? It has been filtered through a Western lens, so much so that it's hard to recognize it sometimes, So taking all these things into consideration, I very often write or try to include characters, side characters, usually from cultures that are not my own, always with research and always with respect and always with beta readers and sensitivity readers who belong to these cultures. And always with the keeping in mind that I think it's okay to write the other, as long as you don't like you say, as long as we stay in our lane and we don't make it about the issues that a person of a specific culture may be facing. Like I can have a character of color in my book, but their experience won't be about being a character of color, because that's not my story to tell, obviously. But that doesn't mean that we only need to write books with people who look like us, because then we lose, the ability to write diverse stories. And that is so difficult. It's such a fine balance, and I'm sure I will make many mistakes along the way. So it's just a learning process.
Yes, I really resonated with a lot of what Danai said and Keir said, just about one being a part of the diaspora. So for me, as an African-American writer, it's kind of a very a tricky thing to kind of navigate, because even though my ancestors are from the continent, I've never been there. I don't have any direct cultural experiences anywhere on Africa, but I do have Gullah Geechee cultural experience, and that's interwoven with my ancestry. So it's kind of hard to navigate. But I usually don't like writing about like other cultures, but I still do it because I think it's impossible to be a writer and not write about cultures that aren't your own. I think you're really limiting yourself if you only write about your own cultures or culture. So I think that if you decide to write about a culture that's not your own, I think you have to really do it with a sense of, first of all, respect. Make sure that you're doing your research, make sure you are not creating caricatures, and make sure that you're creating three-dimensional characters who have, wants and needs and desires that aren't just stereotypical. And I think just being honest about your own culture. Don't try to claim a culture that's not your own, or approach the process as if you belong to that culture. I know some writers have done that in the past. And I think that when readers discover that they aren't of that culture, then there's even more harm and even more offense. So yeah, that's what that would be my advice. And explore your own culture, try to write about your own culture first, because I think a lot of times we shy away from our cultures, whether it's through brainwashing or we learn to undervalue our own culture. But there's a lot of richness that can be found in our own backyard. So write about your own first.
Love that. Thank you. So now, what is one thing that you would recommend to fellow authors for successfully impacting a story with cultural family dynamics? Why don't I just stay with you, Monique, if you don't mind?
Sure. So I would advise authors to create characters who are dynamic, create characters who are diverse, because I think a lot of times when we think of a culture, we then suddenly remove diversity, or we risk removing diversity. But there's a lot of diversity within a single culture. How my family might do something within a culture could be very different from how my neighbor's family might do something within that same culture. So I think being able to show the diversity in a culture is very important, in terms of like hair texture, skin color, dialect. I think it's very important to show the diversity within a community of the same culture, but also across the family. And from that, you can learn a lot about a character. You can learn about a character's education level, their background, their aspirations, just their personality. So I think showing the diversity, I would give that advice.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Danai, how about for you?
I basically agree completely with Monique. A tip that is not really a tip, it's more like a cheat. I like to sometimes place my stories in a near future, or because this gives me a chance to kind of create the world that I would like to see, in terms of representation and diversity and, acceptance of different identities that may not exist still in our times. So this kind of gives me a creative freedom to just do something the way that I would like it to be today. So like I said, maybe this is not a tip, it's more a cheat, because you can't always write science fiction, or you can always write near future. But what if you took this approach and you embedded this approach to your stories, no matter when they're based? Because then, we have this argument that, oh, you're writing historical fiction, you cannot have queer people or people of color in your historical fiction. Yes, you can, because they existed, So maybe just take that mindset of the world that you want to see and realize that perhaps, not everything was so sanitized as, mainstream media and representation up until now would have us believe. So just,
I think the important thing, just to bounce off what Danai was saying, is that it's fiction. It doesn't need to be historically accurate, babe. It's fiction, okay? But for the answer to the actual question, so one thing I'd recommend for successfully impacting a story with cultural family dynamics, I think this actually comes all the way back to what CH said earlier about characters being informed by that culture. Yeah, your characters are informed by their lived experiences, whatever the characters' lived experiences are. And I think that to make a successful impact with a family dynamic, a cultural family dynamic, it all comes down to making sure that the characters' decisions and their changes over time, all of those things are informed by that character's whatever the actual cultural dynamic is, whether they're werewolves and the werewolf family dynamic, whatever it is. I think that's really how to successfully impact the story. And also with impacting a story in mind, I think it has, especially when you've got two characters from different cultural backgrounds or different family dynamic backgrounds, even the tension that can be created in communication or miscommunication between those characters can also certainly add to how you are impacting your story. Puppy! Oh, sorry.
Okay, so yeah, I think one of the things that people can try to do is to, I agree with everything everyone has said so far. Danai, Monique, Carrie, you guys you all have great input and everything I would have said as well. So the only thing that I could say different is to think outside of the box. And the box I'm talking about is Joseph Campbell's monomyth, okay? Because that structure, and I know this touches upon other topics, but that story structure starts with your character being an orphan. And I am just think about giving your character a chance to be something other than an orphan. And that will change your story so much, just right off the bat, right? And that will also force you to think about that family dynamics naturally, because all of a sudden, hey, you have a family to deal with. So yeah, I think, if you want to play with this, start by maybe not making your character an orphan.
Great point. I love that. Thank you, Cindy. All right, so this is our last question. WriteHive's tagline is "Writing the Future We Need." What does that look like for you and for your work? Keir, can I start with you?
It's gay. Sorry. You don't have to cut that though. That is my answer. And I mean that both in the queer sense and in the happy sense. And what does the future? I mean, I think it is diverse in all of the ways, right? Not just racially diverse, but gosh, in any way that you can, and just anything, just pick a demographic and diverse in all of the ways it can be. I think that is what the future looks like, because I also think it is real. It is real. And if we push for true diverse representation in all of the ways, across all of the things, then, I mean, and I say that diverse representation in media, whether that's publishing or another form of media, I think that that is what we should be aiming for all of the time.
For me, I would like to see characters who, for instance, have different abled bodies or different body types, different skin color, different hair textures, different gender identities. And that is not the point of their story. You know, they're not there to tell us about their trauma of existing in said body or said abled or said abilities, you know, but they're there because they can be the kick-ass protagonists, you know, they can go on a quest. They don't have to look a certain way to go on a quest or to rule a universe or two. And I guess that is what I'm trying to write towards, and that is what I love to read as well.
Yes.
Right? Like, yes, thank you.
Yes, all of the above. To me, it looks, and I promise I do read books. I know I keep quoting movies and film, but maybe it's just because my sick brain is thinking visually in movies right now rather than, you know, books. But I look at, you know, something like Bridgerton and how it blew up and how, like, it's a fun romance, right? It's a fun romance series. Why not have fun with it, you know, with more diverse casting and the way that Shonda Rhimes has approached this series? I love what they did with the series. And I love the fact that you know, if you read the books at all, which I did not, I'll fully admit I did not read the original books, but you look at how they're setting up each Bridgerton to have their own love story and happily ever after. And then one of the ones coming up is going to be Colin and Penelope. And I was just telling my husband about this, how they're not just doing a diverse casting in terms of skin color, but also in terms of body types, as Danai was saying. Penelope is not your traditional heroine. She doesn't look like your traditional heroine, but I'm so excited to see her story coming up because of that, because I do think that sort of representation matters, and you know, women need to be able to see themselves as heroines of all types and shapes and sizes and all of this stuff. So, you know, it to me, the future looks like Bridgerton. It also looks like, you know, I was just watching the after show special for Schitt's Creek and how revolutionary Schitt's Creek was, because it portrayed in a world in which being queer was just accepted. Like, there's no homophobia period in that show. And David is just such a delightful character. And I'll be honest, the scene where Patrick's saying to David in that shop just made me sob. It was just such a beautiful scene. And it was just such a great build up to that romance and how that happened and culminated in that scene. It was just so well done. But like, I look at these type of shows, what they're doing, of how they're just presenting the story as is, as Keir and Danai have said, and without having all this trauma and emotional baggage attached with those identities. And it's made me take a step back from my own writing and thinking, all right, I should be able to do more of this. You know, and especially as I get older and I'm tired of talking about trauma and I'm tired of talking about identity crises. It's definitely made me look at my stories and think, all right, how can I think of putting a more positive spin on the world I want to see, and not necessarily the world that we're fighting today? Because yeah, there's a lot that we're having to struggle through today, but we should have something to look forward to, you know, and I need to write that for me as well as, you know, anyone else who's going through the same thing.
Powerful. Thank you. Monique, how about for you?
So for me, it looks like decentralizing the white Western normative gaze. I think once that happens, a lot of other things will be dismantled. Because I'm looking forward to a future where the norm isn't the standard, or white is the norm and everything else is exotic, or novel. So the future to me looks Black.
I like specifically the way you phrase that, like where cis het white abled isn't normative anymore. That's a great way to describe it. Yeah, it's no longer centralized to that descriptor. Sorry, I did not mean to interrupt.
No, you're totally fine. And I agree. Absolutely. So we have reached the end of the panel. I would like to thank our panelists for talking with us today about cultural family dynamics and how they impact the story. We will be here in the chat to continue answering questions from our WriteHive 2022 attendees. But as a parting message, why don't we have everyone briefly let our viewers know what projects you would like to plug and how to find you after the conference. Why don't we start with you, Keir?
Sure. So the only thing I have to plug is that I'm open to queries. I'm only open to queries from people who identify as coming from a marginalized background, whether that means you're BIPOC, LGBT, neurodivergent, disabled, and I mean that's a small list, but any other background also that is marginalized or underrepresented, and send me your manuscripts. That's all I've got. I only represent young adult contemporary and adult and young adult science fiction and fantasy. So those are the only three things I rep. But if you've got a manuscript for me, check out my manuscript wish list, and I hope to hear from you. I spend far more time on Twitter than any person should, but also I am, when I'm not on Twitter, I do live on Discord. So if you hit me up on Discord, you want to add me as a friend or talk to me in the WriteHive, the very large WriteHive conference chat, that's great. And I will be there.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Cindy, any projects you'd like to plug, and how can we find you after the conference?
Well, I already mentioned Choreo, so yay for Choreo. Please keep supporting them. I know they just did their year 2 fundraiser, but they're a fantastic team of writers and editors, and they do fantastic work. All of the stories that they put out are available online as print and on audio and podcasts as well. So they're very accessible. They try to make it as accessible as possible. Other than that, mostly my work is in short stories. So my backlist is all short stories and essays. And that's kind of what I'm still working on. Although my day job has gotten super crazy lately, so we'll see. But yeah, you can find me on my website at chhung.com. I loathe Twitter. So if you DM me on Twitter, I might get back to you in the next month or so. But I'm usually pretty good about email, and there's a contact me form on my website. So, there's that. But thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for being here.
Totally the pro move with regards to Twitter, by the way. Like, that's probably the better move.
Yeah. Let's go on to Danai. Any projects you'd like to plug, and how can we find you after the conference?
So right now, the only thing I would like to mention, as my book is still on submission, so I'm like in that long limbo of waiting to hear back. I would like to say that I'm working as a freelance editor, and I always prioritize marginalized authors, and I always try to, be very mindful of my prices and my packages, because so many people the publishing is so much about gatekeeping, and I just don't want to contribute to that. So you can find my editing services if you click on the link from my WriteHive speaker page, and I am on Twitter all day long and all night long, so you can find me there as well. Thank you so much.
Monique, anything you'd like to plug, and how can we find you after the conference?
Yes, I would love to plug Afronauts podcast. It's the podcast that I founded and co-host, and I co-host it with other Black writers. The goal of the podcast is to uplift the voices of Black speculative fiction writers. So you can definitely check us out. We're available wherever you get your podcast, and you can follow us on Afronauts Pod or at AfronautsPod on Twitter and Instagram. And then for me, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram, mostly Twitter, at Nique the Writer, NIQUE the Writer, and also my website, MoniqueJCollins.com.
Perfect. So thank you so much to everyone for being here today. On behalf of WriteHive, thank you so much for watching, and we hope you have a great rest of your conference.